Well, hello everyone. It is so great to be back for another episode of State of Cybercrime. Hi, my name's Matt Radolec, one of our hosts. I'm joined by one of my esteemed colleagues.
Hey Matt, how's it going?
Um,
I'm David Gibson.
it's great to have everybody here today. We have a jam-packed show for everybody today. We are going to go through some of our normal segments, and if you haven't been here before, we'll definitely tell you about them. One of the things we're absolutely going to talk about is good news. There's always some good news to talk about in State of Cybercrime, and we always like to give credit when law enforcement, government, or even other cyber companies get things right. We'll cover everything and all the happenings that happen in AI with our section on AI Vey. And we'll cover a couple, I think one pretty vulnerable vulnerability, and then jump on the highway to the danger zone and talk a little bit about some threat actors and probably the thing that a lot of you want to hear about, which is Snowflake. And with that, before our marketing hosts get on me for not sharing my sound, I'm just going to reshare and make sure that I'm sharing my sound here. As we've got some really cool clips that we like to play during the show, and I don't want you guys to miss out on the sound from that. So let's get into it. First segment is always
It
on.
worked.
Yeah, look at that. Our first segment is always on good news. We find that in cybersecurity, there's always this doom and gloom outlook. Like, there's only more threat actors and 0 days and people coming after your data. And while that's true, there often is a lot of progress by what people would refer to as the good guys on getting stuff done. And one of those I wanted to shout out really, the Department of Justice, I'd say in 2024 and maybe even late 2023 has really stepped up their game. They've recently arrested the alleged creator and operator of a nearly decade-old anonymizing proxy service botnet in an operation that they called Tunnel Rat. And this brought this 9/11 S5 proxy enabled cyber criminals to rent zombie machines in the locations of their would-be victims, which was something that they did in order to avoid geo-based alerting and blocking. And also when you think about like fraud detection often used by credit card companies and banks where they're looking for you to like making a weird transaction in a new place, if that transaction comes from a place where you're usually, making purchases, it's going to be a lot harder for them to catch that. And that was really the genius behind this botnet. Authorities claim that the operator, who is based in Singapore, was responsible for more than $6 billion, or right around $6 billion in losses between 2015 and 2022.
Crazy. And the delivery mechanism for a lot of the botnets, if I read it correctly, was a free VPN service that you could download, right, and install. Did I get that right? Which
Yeah,
which
that's
made me
right.
think,
It's kind of a guise of being like a proxy service, where you can get
yeah.
around web blocking, but in reality, you're participating as a zombie in a botnet.
Yeah, and I guess the alerts that people get that, hey, some of your traffic is encrypted, they would go unnoticed there. But I mean, I guess the bigger thing that is, anytime something's free, it's chances are you're the product.
Yeah, that's a good way to look at it. Now, that's not the
Yeah.
only good news, though. It seems like Department of Justice has been hard at work, and they've even made a few arrests. David, you want to tell us about that?
Yeah, Operation Endgame. I guess good guys assembled. And they took down 100 servers, 2,000 domains. They arrested 4 people, made these other 8 people infamous. They're in countries like Russia. I think one's in the UAE. But they were able to kind of not arrest everybody, but 4 of the people, and took down a lot of the infrastructure. And this network was responsible or used a lot of the malware that we've seen over the years, right? Like TrickBot. They used like Iced ID.
Yeah, Ice ID is
So
huge.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
And I think they were a part of QuackBot or QBot as well, which is something that we covered, Dave, when the show first started. I feel like we were talking about that on nearly every show. The first it was 100,000, then it was 1 million, then it was something like 3 million people had gotten infected by that, and had fallen bitten to the TrickBot malware and the QBot and the QuackBot malware. Just to zoom out from this for a second, though, we're covering a lot more arrests than we did in the past. I remember early last year, we spoke a lot about coalitions. U.S. federal government says executive order that the US is going to collaborate with law enforcement in foreign countries. Then we saw Interpol and UK Office of Cybercrime say the same thing. Are we starting to realize the gains from that now? Like, are starting to see like the actual operations, the takedowns, the interception by law enforcement? What do you think about that?
I mean, it doesn't come from nothing, right? So there's got to be this. This looks like evidence of some effort, and hopefully the scales can balance a little bit more than they have been, right?
Yeah, and we keep, reinforcing to cyber criminals that if you do the crime, eventually you're going to do the time. In our next segment, in our newest one, AI Vey, everybody loves hearing about AI. Nobody is tired of it. And I'm sure you're all saying AI Vey to yourselves right now. But we'll cover the good, the bad, and the ugly of the happenings as it's related to AI and our eventual demise to robot overlords. First up, though, let's talk about like hugging faces and kind of what is this, and like why should people be worried about vulnerabilities or exploits from actors in hugging faces, David?
This was pretty amazing. I learned a lot. I learned a lot about malicious pickles, which I hadn't been aware of before. I'd never liked pickles, but I didn't realize that some of them were malicious. But what I learned from this, it more than just the stolen authentication tokens, which they are addressing, kind of get more granular. But if you have an authentication token, you can get in to whatever service you have the token for. In this case, it's an AI platform. And the weakness in this AI platform, where basically you can build your own LLMs. And if you think of an LLM as a passive thing, it's actually a lot more complex than that. They have to be complex because in addition to referencing some of these inference APIs, right, or some of these kind of like you might say GPT-4, right, as a language model. In addition to referencing those, you can build your own. And when you do that, you're uploading an LLM package. And some of these AL model formats, some of the popular ones, there's Safe Tensors is popular, and there's Pickle or PyTorch is another one. And what the researchers have kind of recreated is you can upload a malicious Pickle package, and this is where it gets scary. You basically can do a remote code execution from an LLM. And because this infrastructure is shared, you can then move laterally. And in this case, there was a lot of Amazon infrastructure underneath that was potentially accessible, like made other companies' LLMs accessible. So the good news is a lot of this was discovered, I think, early. Before some of these vulnerabilities were really exploited more than the tokens. But I think it's certainly safe to say that some of the end user data has been, you potentially have to look at that. But I think the bigger story, and something that we might see more of, is this remote code execution on these LLMs.
Yeah, it's almost as if we need to think not only about securing our LLMs and like kind of protecting our own organization's data from attack inside of from a copilot or inside of a large language model, but we also need to think as an industry about securing AI as a service. And this wasn't the only story about this, David. There was another one, right?
In fact, there was, and it's clearly happening more by exploiting vulnerabilities in AI LLM containers. This one was a container named Cog, not Pickle. And once they were able to exploit that remote code execution, they were able to see infrastructure in GCP.
Now,
so it's very similar.
Yeah, I keep having flashbacks here to when the App Store came out, and the big debate was between, did you get an iPhone because Apple supposedly, and I think they do, runs like tests and validates the apps that get uploaded to the App Store to make sure they're not stealing data off your phone, whereas like an unlocked phone or the Google Play Store does not have quite as many restrictions on developers that upload applications.
Yes.
Do we need to jump headfirst into that from an AI as a service standpoint and make sure that AI vendors are validating the, things that get uploaded to their services?
Well, that's actually a great question. And apparently, Pickle is it's a Python library, and by its own documentation says it's not secure. It's vulnerable to potential serialization or deserialization attacks and things like this. And so I think that's a good analogy, because like if you were Apple, you probably wouldn't allow pickle based apps in
Right.
your app store.
Right.
If you'll allow me, Matt, I really did want to ask the audience
Sure.
a very important
Yeah.
question. Which band name do you like better, Malicious Pickle or Pickle Malicious? If you could just chat in, I'm struggling with that, and if people could help me out, that would be helpful. Great,
I'm
thank
sure.
you so much.
I'm sure a few people have bit you on the punch. Megan says, "Oh, so a lot of malicious pickles."
Like a lot of malicious
Yeah,
pickle.
a lot of malicious
Okay,
pickles.
that's
Okay.
very
So
helpful. Thank you.
maybe what we're getting at is that this style of attack, we'll see if this catches on as a trend, is this AI as a service injecting bad code into an AI as a service is a malicious pickle attack. How about that?
I, I,
Let's see if it sticks. Let's see if it sticks. Okay. But speaking of things that stick or don't stick, I feel like I got to come out and say it. We need to recall. Here's just like, and this is another happening in AI that is from like just a complete dystopian nightmare. I'm sure some of our audience members have watched Black Mirror, and recall brings me back to that episode where you can replay things that have happened in your life. And I think Microsoft has actually kind of already recalled it already by not enforcing users to have to opt into it as opposed to being on by default in the new Copilot laptops. And Kevin Beaumont, a former Microsoft threat intel analyst, calls it a disaster. Says that with just 2 lines of code, you can see anything that your computer has. How recall works is it captures what you're working on and allows like the Copilot AI to search through it and find it faster. So on the surface, like, wow, great, another thing that's going to like help me be more productive at work. It's incredibly dangerous. Anything that you've ever opened or worked on your computer, even files that aren't stored on your computer but stored in the cloud, could be seen, at least in part, by recall. And so I thought to myself, like, man, that's pretty dangerous in the hands of an attacker, but also in the hands of law enforcement. Like they now can see like snippets and parts of files or even like government snooping on a laptop that they get control of, even if that original document sits in a secure container somewhere else. I even thought a little bit about how, working on investigations a lot, David, when you're doing insider threats, you have to prove motive. And I feel like recall would also be really useful at trying to show the motive of someone and building that story towards why it is they were doing something on a particular computer. But the good news for everyone here is Microsoft has already made it so that you have to opt into it. But many security pros, myself included, are really urging people to stay away. So I'll say it again. I really think we should recall.
I think you're onto something there. It's a very scary thing. I mean, all your passwords are going to be in there because it logs every key. I mean, you might as well print all your keyboard history on Post-it notes and paste it all around your house.
Yeah.
And the other thing is, it's so we've seen what happens when you take stuff out of context. Like recordings or snippet. It just imagine the use of this if you wanted to, convince somebody that well, I mean, it's a really scary thing.
Yeah. Now, I know we probably cover some of the most vulnerable vulnerabilities that are out there, and the one that caught our attention, David, other than all this stuff that's going on with AI, is some routers. Some massive number of routers came under attack. What the heck happened there?
Yes, and I think there's a trend for CD Flora that starts with a P, because apparently the ISP was codenamed Pumpkin Eclipse, but all of these routers in this ISP got taken down all at once. It was about 600,000 like small office home routers, like Soho routers, right? And it basically installed Chalubo, which is another cool name, but it's a remote access Trojan. It's actually a pretty common one. But then it bricked the Soho routers. So this is a pretty scary thing. This happened over a 3-day period. Single ISP taken out, and it's I think we've seen this before as a precursor to war. I mean, if this is like a proof of concept thing, that's really scary.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's just the scale of this and just one flaw. If, when everybody has one common component that they rely on, that's a massive single point of failure.
And just before we jump onto the danger zone and talk about probably why a lot of people are here was talking about Snowflake, the chat is really lighting up about this recall thing. And I just want to go over a couple of things that people are saying here. One, from Bradley, if only a threat actor could gain control, opt in to recall, and then basically reduce their footprint to just utilize recall to do all of the hard work on the recon and the data theft, and you wouldn't even necessarily know what's happening. The other thing it really like shines for me is, and I'm curious, a couple people want to put in the chat. Anyone use like a password manager or password vault where you have to like log into a system and then you can like see the password for just like a second and then you have to copy and paste it? Like I now can just go back in the recall to see what those passwords were. And I just feel like maybe that this isn't the right, there's got to be some way that we can limit it or kind of censor what goes into it. It seems like it was something that just got rushed out and is way too dangerous versus kind of being beneficial from at least a corporate, enterprise, use case.
Yeah, it's a nuts single point of failure there too. It's even if you're really paranoid and have a password manager and put a pin in after everyone or before everyone or in the
Gonna
middle
get
of
the
everyone,
yeah, yeah.
you're gonna get the pin.
You're gonna get all
You
of it.
know,
Yeah.
yeah,
Well, now in our final segment, the danger zone, we usually cover threat actors and happenings in the cybersecurity space that people should know about. And first up is this North Korean threat actor, formerly known as Storm 1789, now called Moonstone Sleet. It was really known for kind of stealing money, financial type fraud, and cyber espionage. And why the rebrand is they've really stepped up their game. They're known for setting up things like fake companies and fake job opportunities in order to engage targets, but they also employ Trojanized versions of legitimate tools. I'll give you an example with one related to Putty in a second. And they've even created a fully functional video game in order to get users to put the malicious code onto their computers.
yeah.
Ultimately, when you look at a cybercrime, but APT grade cybercrime, there are some similarities to your everyday ransomware as a service operator, but their bag of tricks is just way more sophisticated and harder to avoid. They have custom exploits, custom loaders, tools that aren't going to be detected. You got to find them attacking the outcomes and their targets. You're not going to find them from catching the exploits or the CNC infrastructure that they drop on your computers. I think one of the most novel things that they did was they repackaged their own version of Putty to create malicious terminal sessions to LinkedIn and Telegram to send people malicious zip files that otherwise appeared as completely legitimate. I think another thing that kind of stuck out to me about this was that there is a little bit of a targeted nature of it as well. So they'll create a custom loader that looks like it's from software that's been packaged by your company once they figure out how your company packages software. So they're going to extra lengths to try to disguise themselves as an otherwise legitimate service and copying legitimate tools.
Yeah, they actually, I think they have websites that look like legitimate businesses, and that this malicious game, I have to, when my son gets home from school, I'm going to ask him, "Did you ever play D-Tank, DE Tank?"
Oh,
Because
is that what?
then I got
Oh,
to
okay.
yeah, there's one, and there's another one like DeFi Tank, right? Which I'm hoping is more crypto related, but and he wouldn't have been interested. But D Tank sounds right up his alley,
Yeah, I was
and
gonna say, yeah, there's another popular tank game like
yeah,
that. That's probably what they were going after. Now, that's not the
yep,
only actor though, David, that people should be worried about.
yep.
And especially if you're a critical infrastructure or a healthcare company, Black Basta should be on your radar. They've been touted by both the FBI and CISA as a major threat to the global healthcare sector. Their MO is the pretty typical ransomware actor: disrupt your operations, steal data, unleash ransomware, and they've had some success and seen success in the healthcare industry. So I'd like to say that they're refocusing their metaphorical eye of Sauron on healthcare companies across North America, Europe, and Australia. And something, just to keep in mind about this, the TTPs tend to be pretty similar across these different ransomware actors. They're either going to use an initial access broker to land, try to find the data that they're looking for, something that's going to give them a meaningful bit to exfiltrate and ransom, but they're also heavily focused on disrupting operations, as that's what, is going to lead someone to pay the ransom, right? Ultimately, to like gain control of their network, get their billing system back into, back into works. Definitely something to keep an eye on and be concerned about if you're critical infrastructure, but especially if you're a healthcare company operating in, North America, Europe, or Australia.
Yep, these actors keep going, keep using similar techniques. They keep making use of spiders. That's I say that because they're related to Wizard Spider, right, as well, or they have some
Or it's a
resemblance to that as
rebrand.
well.
Yeah, maybe
Yeah,
a,
rebrand.
a rebrand. Maybe we got like a Black Cat Alpha B, one person and a couple people from Wizard Spider, and they do a rebrand. Now, that's probably not the biggest story though, right? Like the
No.
campaign that both David and I have been really excited to talk with everybody about. And I think if we weren't at, Snowflake or at InfoSec London or at the Salesforce London event this week, I probably would have had the show earlier in the week, is Snowflake. Now, as I look at this campaign against Snowflake customers, I'm having flashbacks to 23andMe. And we'll talk more about that in a couple minutes. But, David, something happened early on when like the Snowflake breach hit the news. It got people really worked up, and it appears like it might have been some fake news. Can you tell us a little bit more about like what we're talking about?
Yeah, it despite the early report to the contrary, and which has been taken down, there is no evidence. This is a quote from I think Snowflake and Mandiant. There's no evidence to suggest vulnerabilities in Snowflake's product or did any data exfiltration caused by compromised credentials of a current or former Snowflake employee. That was the initial report, but what it looks like is that a lot of Snowflake accounts don't have MFA enforced. And this is, obviously when you don't have MFA enforced on the Snowflake account, that's a pretty huge risk factor, as I'm sure everybody on this webinar knows. But I think that really, enforcing MFA has traditionally fallen in the realm of the customer's responsibility in the shared responsibility model. And I think, and this probably is what you're saying with the 23andMe comparison, maybe such critical data should not be accessible without multi-factor.
I mean, I'll call it out now. I think we should be pressuring regulators to say that, if there's like, sensitive regulated data behind whatever thing you're running and you don't have multi-factor authentication in front of it, you're kind of like opening the door for what happened here. And I don't, when I take it back to 23andMe and Snowflake didn't do this, in the initial handling of the 23andMe incident of a similar type, that they blamed the users for reusing passwords and using weak passwords. I can't sit here and say it's the Snowflake user's fault for not turning on MFA. We could say, hey, in the shared responsibility model, the companies that bought and operate Snowflake should be the ones that are turning on, and we'll actually show you how to do that in just a second. But it just begs the question, like, are we at a point where, and I know some people are saying, oh, let's move past passwords, let's move past multi-factor, but are we at a point where it should be mandated potentially by a regulatory body? And I'm usually never one to suggest regulation is the answer, so that if there's sensitive data in there, we have to have multi-factor authentication in front of it.
It certainly is a valid question. I don't know if I don't know what the argument is against it, except it's inconvenient. I mean, it's interesting, like with 23andMe, I think it's that's used by everybody with so many different degrees of technical sophistication, so I think it's a big argument, right? Like you got to have you got to kind of enforce it because there are a lot of people that don't know any better. I think you could argue that, corporate users should potentially know better. But then again, we see a lot of like non-technical business users or, non-technically oriented, very, data scientists that, but they wouldn't necessarily think of it. And the other point on this is, I think since it's a corporate application, and maybe correct me if I'm wrong here, but you could potentially forget you didn't have MFA on. If you have MFA on with something like Okta and use
Right.
that to authenticate to Snowflake, but you didn't do the actual Snowflake account,
Right.
should we unpack that a little bit?
Yeah. So what David's getting at, and at Varonis, we call this like identity versus logical identity. David and me, we have accounts in the Varonis domain, but that account exists inside of SaaS applications as well. And if that account has some password that is replicated to like Snowflake, and it's brute forceable because the multi-factor is not on Snowflake, it's on the identity provider that we put in front of it, and we didn't disable direct login on the other side, there's a way for an attacker to get through that. And this happens quite often, where either organizations think that everything is routed through their VPN, so it's never going to happen, but they don't realize that they can also log in directly to the application. All this said, we do have a little bit of a get well plan if you want to start to unpack that, David.
Yeah, make it so. Oh, so I guess that's for
I was
me.
going to say, I was going to give you a chance to tell people what the first thing they should do is.
Yeah, well, so we are able to very quickly install and take a look at Snowflake if you're not already looking at Snowflake with Varonis, and isolate, identify those users that don't have MFA enabled. So that's a very simple thing for us to do, right out of the gate. So, and after that, what do you recommend there, Matt?
Yeah, I was going to say look, step one, you got MFA on? Like, no, turn it on. Step two, whether you do or not, you probably have sensitive content inside of Snowflake. So important to find out where it is and where it's exposed. Because another way that sensitive data could leave your Snowflake is every user, and we see this quite often, has the ability to share outside the organization or collaborate on particular data inside of Snowflake, and you're allowing them to share sensitive content. So where this got kind of like a daisy chain effect or a Russian doll effect for this attack is initial person gets brute forced. They have high levels of sharing privileges. They share externally so that now the attacker, even if you overcome the brute force and the MFA, they now have persistent access through sharing and collaboration. And so step two is figure out like where the exposure is to be able to figure out where that sensitive content is and make sure that it's not shared externally or publicly. And if it is, to do something about it. What happens next? What else?
Yeah, well, then it definitely ought to take a look at what's been happening with the sensitive data, right? Whether that has been shared, has been accessed unusually, if there's any evidence after an account was compromised, right? What they've been doing, or you can potentially see if somebody's looking like they've been accessing a lot more stuff than usual as well.
And I was on one of our healthcare clients earlier this week, and they swore that this attack, quote, couldn't have happened to them, quote, because they have MFA enabled everywhere, quote. And I, really tried to dig into it with them. And what we did was we looked at the audit events of the actual authentications to Snowflake. So regardless of how they thought they had checked the permission settings already and whether or not the config was set, as it turns out, there were still dozens and dozens of users that were authenticating without MFA due to like third-party agreements, APIs, and other methods. And so even though they thought that they had it set up like through a identity provider like Okta, as it turns out, there's still many, many users that could get in with just a username and password. All of these would have been vulnerable to that, kind of password spray, account enumeration, brute force style attack that led to that massive kind of widespread compromise. So audit, like see if people outside your organization are accessing that sensitive content, but two, if they're authenticating without MFA.
And that's a good thing to capture if any account has MFA turned off, and monitor for that, as well as what should we be looking for in terms of the activity there.
So, yeah, and what your network access policies are. So to go back to that use case around, can someone get to Snowflake without being on your corporate network on a VPN or have through single sign-on? If you allow direct access to Snowflake, you might want to consider setting up policies that would prevent that. And then the last thing, David, I'll let if again, should be doing this all the time, but definitely think about monitoring your Snowflake.
Absolutely. Legitimate people will end up needing access to sensitive data in order to do their jobs, and making sure they're not compromised. Those accounts, MFA apparently can be bypassed too. So, it's not a catch-all for everything. So definitely want to be monitoring what people are doing after they authenticate. I think Dan said very well, folks, post-authentication attacks do exist.
Yeah, and we got a good question from Moira. Maybe we could cover, David, which is, was Snowflake data for different customers leaked? Were they all accessed using different credentials? at first it looks like it was one employee that had tenant access.
So that was the first report that I mentioned that has since been taken down and has been challenged by Snowflake and Mandiant. I know of at least two companies that have had data. There's been a report that data, Snowflake data was out there, but those, it sounds like, may have been a result of compromised credentials. Is that your read on it too?
Yeah, yeah. And again, if you guys hadn't heard of 23andMe, and maybe our production team can post a link to our State of Cybercrime episode about 23andMe. If you guys could do that, it'd be awesome. It's very, very similar, where there's just a massive, think of it like a password spraying attack, where there were either known usernames and passwords, or maybe a combination of known and unknown, and some were guessed, and they were able to simultaneously gain access to many, many snowflakes because of password reuse. And we'll stick around and see. I didn't see any other questions come in. Let me just do a quick read through. Otherwise, as always, I want to thank you guys, our audience. This show is made possible by our audience, and thanks for your participation and being here with us. We hope that you enjoyed the show today. Anything you want to add, David?
Just thanks so much, everybody, and love the comments in the chat. And I'll let you know how my band, Malicious Pickle,
how
does.
Malicious Pickle does, or whether or not we can get the news outlets to pick that up as this, kind of AI as a service, remote code execution and injection attack. Should we call it a malicious pickle or not? Well, thanks so much. If you guys wouldn't mind just filling out a quick feedback survey before you leave, we'd really appreciate it. Otherwise, have a great rest of your day.